Welcome everyone. I hope everybody is doing fine and has kind of like recovered from the storm and have back in power and so on. So today's lecture will be about some technology that we still need to cover. I'm aware that this isn't like we've have 3 tech lectures in a row, and usually I like to do like one theory, one tech lecture, but because of the cancellation and some of the scheduling constraints, this is where we are right now. But starting next week, we'll have tech lectures again, and then we also have activities again. The tech lectures are really packed usually, and I kind of have to get through the stuff so that you guys are all equipped for homeworks. So what we'll do today is we'll run through like basic steps, how you can actually run a web server and how you could set up an IDE. We talked about this in the lab briefly, but so I'm going to keep it short. Then next we will be looking at general purpose DOM manipulation with the standard DOM API library. Then we'll be looking at events. How can we actually react to something that the user does in the browser? And then finally, a deeper dive into D3. And this should give you all of the skills that you need for homework 3. I'm happy to take any questions now if there are any administrative questions. Well, okay, if not, I'll start sharing my screen. So this is again on the tutorials website. Okay. This is again on the tutorials website. So let's get started. By the way, if I'm breaking up or if you have a hard time hearing me, let me know. I can turn off my video. Last time this helped a little bit. Okay. Great. So how do we run a web app? First, like if you have an HTML or JavaScript or CSS file or anything like that, some of them you can just open in the browser. So for example, here's this like a file that I'm linking here, and I can actually like download this file and then store it somewhere on my local computer. And then if I open this up, if I open this up in my downloads, I can just double click it and run it, and it's going to work. So that works for simple files, but it doesn't work for files whenever you need to load the data set or for other cases. And the reason behind that is that browsers, this is a security consideration. Browsers don't want you to execute something from your computer so that there's nothing malicious going on. And so you have to run, whenever you have a separate data file, you have to run this through a server. And so there's a couple of different ways of doing that. But one way we recommend is that you simply like run a Python server. And so you could do something like this. I could go to the Viz 2020 folder, or actually I want to go to the, well, yeah, that's fine. I could go to the Viz 20 folder and then to the homeworks folder. And now here, I actually only have the default Python installed. So I just recently reinstalled my computer, so I don't have a Python 3 running yet. And then now I could run a simple HTTP server, and then I can go to 0, 0, and 8000, and it will list all of the homeworks. And so here I can look at the homework 2 stuff. You don't really see anything because it's empty. But that's how you run a web server.
Austrian.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow.
Can you guys please mute yourself? Thank you. So that's the easiest part. And when you change something in the backend, this is updated, so you should immediately see your changes. What we do recommend is that you use an IDE, and like we do recommend either Visual Studio Code or WebStorm or its PyCharm variant, which is kind of like a both are from JetBrains. Sorry.
Hey. What?
I'm just trying to mute everybody. Okay. So when you what you can do in something like PyCharm is like, well, first it's an IDE, right? So it has like lots of other features, but I can also say something like, hey, run this code or debug that code here. And that will just open up a new Chrome window. And that Chrome window, if I like execute something, I put in a breakpoint here earlier, I can now like actually inspect all of the variables. I can step through it. So yeah, here I could step over it and look at the execution and hover over the elements and see exactly what are the variables that are defined in here and so on. So that's kind of like a neat thing, and I can dynamically edit it in here, and it will immediately apply, and then I'll see it again here. So if I kind of like continue my execution, oops. If I remove that breakpoint and if I continue my execution here, then I can like actually run this. So here, this is an example that we'll be looking at the end of the day today. Okay. So much for that. This was just like an FYI. Take a look at if you're interested in running this with WebStorm or Visual Studio Code. You can do that with the help of the description here and some of the links. So now I want to jump into the interactive DOM manipulation bit. Last time we did cover DOM manipulation with D3, but I want to take a little bit of a step back and look a little bit of how does this work with the standard tools that the browser gives us. Because behind the scenes, what D3 does is it generates codes like this, and this is how everything is actually happening. And so it's useful to know what's going on. So the main thing that we care about here is the document object, and the document object is our interface to the whole browser, to everything that we want to manipulate. And so this is like a globally defined object. So we can, for example, here log the document object, and if we do that, we will see that this is like the document object itself is exactly like, if you log it, it is just the website that you are currently rendering. But then you can access functions on this document object. So you can say things like document.getElement by ID main div, and I have defined main div here with the ID. And so now I'm holding this div in that variable, and then I can log that div. And you can see here is that div. So this is the text in HTML. And then I can actually manipulate this this div. So here I'm creating, I'm calling document create element, a paragraph, and then I have this stored in my new paragraph. Then I say new paragraph append child, and I'm adding a text node, and then appending, and then I'm appending the child, the paragraph here to the main div. And the result of that is that this piece here of the website is dynamically added in JavaScript. This piece here was already there in the HTML file. So this is like how we can manipulate web pages using the standard API. And what you can see here is that this is like, of course, a lot more complicated than if we do it with D3. And that's why we're using like tools like D3 or jQuery or React, because this is not always the most convenient way to do that. So yeah, like here, like our links to these different function descriptions, it doesn't really matter that you understand the details of them. This is just like an FYI that you can do that. And so now, because we now know we can like manipulate HTML, we can use any kind of like programming structures like functions and loops and so on to create dynamic text in HTML. So here, for example, this is our body here only contains this single div, and then we add all of this other stuff here dynamically using this this loop here, and append child, and then like we have created a function, a helper function to create a div with text. And so this is just like essentially applying the basic programming concepts to the DOM manipulation here. this is how you could structure how you could build an interactive web application. We can also control the attributes of elements. For example, we can style and position them. Here we are setting like the position for a particular text element, and then we are also setting its color. And the result is that we can do something like this. So we can basically have arbitrary freedoms of generating content on the page. And again, I don't really want to go into detail here what's going on. It is fairly easy to read. It's just like a demonstration of you can do these kinds of things directly with the browser API. That can go even as far as I can do animations. So I'll show you first what this is doing. This is kind of like a rainbow of numbers that are dynamically here, like increasing their value and changing colors as they move along, as they're being positioned. And so, well, what's going on here? It's actually fairly similar to before. The only difference here, what is unique, is that we, like, as you remember in JavaScript, since it's kind of like an prototype-based language, we can actually add new functions to elements, including DOM elements at runtime. So here, like, I'm actually retrieving this text element. I'm calling it node here. And then I'm adding a new function to that node element. And that kind of like updates its position and its color according to some kind of simple formula that I run down there. But the key part about this simple example here is that I am actually adding a function to a DOM element. And then later, I'm actually calling that function here in an endless loop. So with node updates. So I'm calling this function that I just added to a pre-existing object up here. And here I'm just doing some styling again and so on. And the second trick here is, because I'm doing an animation, if I just did like a while an endless for loop, yeah, I would get kind of like my computer would essentially bog down, because it will just like consume computing power and run as fast as it can. What I'm doing instead here is I'm calling the window, which is the browser. I'm calling the request animation frame, and then I'm calling a recursive call to myself here. So that essentially ensures that this here is updated every time the browser redraws, but not more frequently. So if I did this here, it would actually crash my browser. So I'm not going to show it. But if you want, you can try it on your computer, but you'll have to like restart your browser afterwards. Okay, so that's kind of like the very quick introduction into the standard DOM. Now I want to talk a little bit about JavaScript events, which is also kind of like part of the standard DOM, but they are like more relevant to what we will be doing in the rest of this course. So like what we've done so far is like all of the websites had, or all of the stuff we had didn't really have events in it. So we didn't have user interactions. But I can actually, in JavaScript, it's fairly easy to get input and listen to events. And so here I've created two buttons. And if I click a button, I get this message box, an alert box. And so what is going on here? I'm showing you a couple of different methods how I can specify that. So here I have a button, and the button has an attribute on click. And here I can actually specify a JavaScript function name in the global namespace, which I'm defining then like message me is this function that I'm defining here. So here in HTML, I'm defining the reference, what is supposed to be called on click. So that's one way of doing it. The other way is not having a direct reference, but just giving the button an ID. I can also, well, so if I just give the button an ID, I can later retrieve that with document get element by ID, my button, and then on click and assign this function, this anonymous function here on click. And so you see, you chose me button 2. And if I click that, you can see that this is exactly the text that I get. So this actually works. So personally, I prefer kind of like this way of doing it, right? Because I don't think that JavaScript functions should be, there should be like as there shouldn't be a JavaScript function called directly from HTML. This is not very robust against refactoring and so on. So like you should probably go for this way here, even though this is a little bit more succinct. And then finally, like it doesn't have to be a button. I can also click anything. Anything on the browser, any DOM element is clickable or hoverable or anything like that. So here I've just clicked this div, and it puts out this "see you don't have to be a button to be noticed" message. So this works just as well as with a button. Buttons are kind of like nice because they have semantics, but they're not really special in that sense. And so onClick is only one of the possible events. There's plenty of other events that you might care about, for example, on hover. But here is like you can have on animation start, on blur, on focus, on cancel, on change, on close, and so on. So there's like many different events that you can listen and react to. And this works just as with like onClick. So you essentially always pass in, or you specify a function, what is happening when you are actually receiving that event.
I had a question about this.
Sure.
Are those actually methods of? Do those methods belong? Because we're getting an element. Are they like interface for element types?
So
because we're
what I'm doing here. Yeah, so these are like, I'm not completely sure I understand your question, but let me just like explain this quickly again, and then you can tell me whether I answered your question. So here I'm retrieving a document element, right? This is the actual, now at this point, I actually have the button in this variable. And then the button has a function onClick that is kind of like that I'm overriding here. And that onClick function is called by the browser when a click happens.
Oh, so this onClick method that we're overriding, we can apply it to other elements as well. Is that correct?
Exactly. Any DOM element you can like there is an onClick defined on it.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you. That answers my question.
Perfect. Great. So here is an example there where I'm showing you like I have a drop-down box with pear, apple, and plum, and I'm dynamically updating this field here. This is just HTML text based on that drop-down box. So here's how I would do that. First, I'm using a drop-down box is select is the select element. I give it 3 values: pear, apple, and plum. Then I say that the first one by default, I want the apple to be selected. And then I have my div, my favorite fruit, and that has a span in here that is empty with another ID fruit. And this is where I'll be writing this like plum and all of this stuff dynamically. So first thing I do in JavaScript here is I'm retrieving this span and then setting the inner HTML to the value of the dropdown box. The value and like get element by ID dropdown.value gives me the value that I've defined in this attribute here. So like I'm taking like by doing this, I'm retrieving the default value, the selected value here in this case, and setting it to the inner HTML. And this is why like if I like rerun this, this is why apple here is appearing from the very beginning. And then what I'm doing next is on change. I'm overriding this on change event with this function so that this kind of change here happens. So on change, I call a function with the event. And then I say, like, I'm retrieving document get element by ID fruit.inner HTML. This is the same line as up here. So I'm retrieving like the span that contains this plum word here. And then I'm assigning it. The event is a parameter that I'm being passed along here. And that contains the element that was clicked. Event.target is the element that was in this case changed, and then .value. So that is kind of like very simple way to retrieve the content and change the Dropbox. And this is then written to the HTML and updated. Here would be a different way of doing the same thing. Here I'm just like not using, here I'm using this event parameter, but I don't actually have to use it, right? I can say document get element by ID drop down value. So I can kind of like copy the same line here But yeah, either way is fine in this case.
What exactly is the event?
The event is kind of like the payload, essentially. Like, what are you like? What did you interact with the DOM element?
Okay.
So it will contain the tongue. The target contains the DOM element. The event will have other stuff in there, such as like what kind of event was it and so on.
So inner HTML is an event?
No, inner HTML is not an event. This is like I'm taking the value of that HTML element that's stored in this target here, and I'm setting this to the inner HTML of that element here.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So this of course works just as well with SVG. So here I have like a little rectangle that I initialized in my SVG, and every time I click it, it changes color and it grows. And so how do I do that? I'm simply saying, here I started off with this rectangle. I'm retrieving that element, my bar, and then I'm assigning this new variable to it, data, and I'm setting that to null or 0. And data here is like I'm using the style that D3 uses, but of course this could be anything, right? This is just a variable name, but D3 uses this __ data to do that behind the scenes. And then I'm saying document get element by ID, my bar on click do this. And on click, I have like an array of colors that I'm rotating through. I'm taking the rectangle out of the event with the target variable here. And then I'm increasing the width of the rectangle. So I'm from rectangle, I'm retrieving the get attribute width. I'm casting that to a number. And then I'm setting the attribute and increase it by 10. And so this is how this rectangle keeps growing. And then finally, I'm setting the style by simply like modulate, like rotating over over the different colors that I have in here. So it's very simple, but like the point of this is really that, again, I can manipulate SVG elements dynamically. I can react on elements, on events that are triggered on SVG elements. And so we'll be using this extensively in the rest of the class. Okay, any more questions about events before I move on to the D3 advanced lecture?
This might be a bigger topic than we can kind of go over, but let's say you had like a dynamic amount of bars that you want to grow. Right now we're using the ID to change those. Are we dynamically somehow generating IDs so that you can have like my bar 1, my bar 2, so forth, or would there be a different way of approaching that?
So you can do that, but you probably don't want to. Like, let's suppose you have an array of data and you have an array of bars. What you would just get is like you get a list of bars, right? And then you create those list of bars in the for loop, for example, in the browser. And so then you can say then you wouldn't use you can specify the onClick function as you iterate over those rectangles.
Okay, perfect.
And you would just like use the same function all the time, right?
So you basically have like an array of recs, if I kind of understand correctly.
Yes.
Great.
But this would be kind of like the way to do it just with the basic DOM stuff. With D3, we'll do this a little bit differently.
Okay.
I'll show this next.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Okay. So then let's move on to the more advanced D3, more in selections and data and scales and access and so on. So like a quick recap over like what stuff that we already heard, but I think it's just useful to get everybody on the same page and bring it back to everybody's mind again. So what we do in D3, first thing is we can select elements based on CSS selectors. So for example, we can say select SVG, that would select an element of type SVG, but only one. We can say select all.className, that would select all elements of type class name, or we can say select all for ID cancel button. But of course, we can also use arbitrary complex selection expressions, for example, like here, this parent-child relationship. So this would select the spans that are direct descendants of the paragraph. So like anything that you can do in CSS with these selections, you can do in D3. And so here is just a simple example again. We've seen this before. I have these spans in the paragraphs, and then I call D3 select all on P span, and then I'm styling the span selection here with the color blue. And so I'm kind of like get those blue, these words that are in the span, they are blue, everything else remains black. So we've seen this before, this is nothing new, but now let's take a look at what happens behind the scenes. So like it's kind of useful for debugging to understand what's going on. Like when I have a selection, that selection has these 3 different arrays, and the one that you care about for updates is this groups array. So I can actually show this live. So in here, I will have printed my selections, and then here, this is the select all that I've done on these spans, and in these groups, I have my span elements that I can hover over here and see where they are. And so this is the update selection, just to recall, right? And if we have enters and exits, then they will appear here in addition to the groups. But this is kind of like where things are going on. So that's kind of important to know here. And then the second big thing about D3, in addition to those selections, like selections are something that you can do, for example, easily with jQuery. But what's unique about D3 is this data mapping, so this data binding. So here, I'm doing like, I have a bar chart with 3 bars, and then I'm mapping some data to it. We've seen this also before. But just to recap, I am selecting, where is it? So here I'm calling svg.selectAllRect. So I'm selecting all of the rectangles, and then I'm logging that selections. And then here I'm binding the data to that selection. So now I have these elements in the group array, and I'm assigning those data items to those elements. And since we have like a perfect match, 3 data elements, 3 elements in the group array, everything will be stored in this data variable. So this is what I mentioned earlier. Let's take a look at the console here. So if I open up the console and then run this, so you can see here is my selection. I have again my group with the node lists, and then I should be able to find the data in those. Did I print those before? This is after that. So here are my rectangles, and in those rectangles, somewhere at the very bottom, there should be my data. So this is the 127 that I wrote to that by doing the data binding. So this is what's going on here. Okay, so all of this, we talked about this before. You should also see the similar to the group array, you will have an enter and an exit array for all the items that didn't match any DOM element, or where we have like a DOM element too much, and then the group element. So these are the 3 arrays for the selections, and we can look at them exactly. And this data is what we then eventually use to, for example, style. Like in this case, we styled the width based on that data, and this is what we're doing with like a function like this. We're setting the width to the data here. And optionally, we have like the second parameter of these functions is always the index, like the index of the element that I'm currently operating on. And we always seen this graphic before too, but this is still important to think about again. The enter selection here are all of the elements that have a data point, but they don't have a corresponding DOM element. The updates have both a data point and a DOM element. The exits have a DOM element, but don't map to a data point. And so I need to create the data, the elements for the enter. I need to remove the elements for the exit, and I need to update the elements for for wherever we have a match between data and elements in these selections. Okay, so as I already said in the last lecture, we don't usually start out with an SVG. We usually start out like you do in your homework with an empty canvas, and then we create this from scratch, right? And so we do that by actually simply selecting on an element that doesn't exist, and then mapping the data. And now here, this object will contain the enter and the exit selection because the initial selection is empty, but there's not going to be anything in a group selection. And then here we call enter. And now we have our enter selection, and then we can do something with the enter selection. We are appending rectangles to it, and we are styling those rectangles. We're giving it an X position, we're giving it a Y position, we're giving it a width and a height, and so on. And this is then what the result of that is. Okay, so here, if we look at this behind the scenes, we have like, you can see these enter, like before I have actually assigned them like an element, they are this generic enter node that has like I open up the enter node here. You can see the enter node doesn't have anything that the typical DOM element has, except for this data element that I've specified. So these are kind of placeholder elements that are stored in the enter selection until you actually append an element to it. So as soon as you append this element, these placeholder enter nodes are replaced, in this case, by rectangles. And then the data is moved over, essentially. And then you have all of the properties of the rectangle at that point. Okay, so now let's take a look at an update. Here is an example that handles like enter, exit, and update correctly. So I am kind of calling run here, and then I'm switching to another data set and run and another data set. And so you can see that between those two data sets, everything here is handled correctly. Elements are added, elements are removed, and elements are updated. So I'm doing all three. I'm taking care of all three selections here. This is just like switching between the data. And so either the default data that I pass in here or another data set. Then here I'm doing my data join. Again, here I'm specifying how I'm removing the elements in the exit selection, and I'm just calling remove. So this is bars.exit remove. This is going to be a hard remove, no animation or anything like that. They're just going to be gone. Then how do I handle new elements? I say bars.enter.append rectangle. I set the class to bars because I actually selected on a class bars here, not on the element rectangles. And then I'm merging the enter and the update selection. Remember, this is kind of the way to like after I have initialized it, before I update and style it, I can merge it, the enter selection into the update selection so that I can then manipulate and update and style both of those selections at the same time without having to duplicate code. So here is now how we handle the updates and style the newly added elements. And I'm doing just the same as I did before. So I don't have to go over the styling. And here I'm just setting another data set. And then the result is that all of this here is handled correctly. And I mentioned before that if you just want to do something like this, there's another way of doing it. So if you don't want to do something special to your enter or exit selections, you can also use the selection join syntax. And the selection join syntax here takes a parameter that corresponds to the element that you want to create. So you're telling D3 here, add rectangles and also like merge this with my enter and update selection and also remove all of the elements in the exit selection. So this is kind of like taking care of all of those things at the same time. And if you want to keep it simple, this is actually fairly prudent. So this is like a nice way to do this. This works well. But if you want to manipulate this a little bit more, if you need to kind of like do an animation or have like something special to do with updates and or versus enters, then you have to like do the above way here. Okay, so this is kind of like the most important part about D3. So if you have any questions, this would be like a great time to ask them.
What does that second line do? That was like class bars true. Yeah,
This here, I'm
correct.
just setting, this is just an attribute, the convenience method that sets the class for all of the elements in the selection to bars.
Gotcha. Perfect. Thank you. So if you did not do that, then you would like lose those, and they would no longer be in the class.
Yeah, so here, because I'm handling all of the enters and updates at the same time, this would actually not work because I'm selecting on the .bars here. So an update would break if I don't have that. So this is kind of like if I inspect those elements here, you can see that the rectangle here has the class bars. And I need that, right? Because I'm actually selecting on that particular attribute here.
Great, thank you.
I had a question. Oh,
Sure.
sorry.
ahead.
Instead of doing .classBars, that's just the same thing as writing attribute with class and then writing bars after that. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, okay, sweet.
I don't necessarily have a preference for either of them. They both are kind of the same. D3 has for very convenient, for very common attributes, it often, like style, for example, you could also say attribute style. But for very common, it has these shortcut methods. Okay, so yeah, this is like mapping, data mapping, joining, creating elements, and so on. And so everything we'll do from now is going to be on top of that. And so here, like what I said earlier, last lecture, is that D3 is really great for transitions. We kind of like didn't really get to look at this in detail, but here I'm going to like first show you what this can do. This is kind of like fading in data and transitioning between an original element, and then I can switch between different data sets and get these nice animations. And this is like almost free. And so that's why, like, one of the reasons why D3 is cool, because I can do something like this, and this is all taken care of for me. And so how do I do this? This is like very similar as we had before. Here I'm just like, the interesting piece here is when I create new rectangles, I am starting them with a width of 0 and the color gray. So if I, let me clear this again. So if I run this, you see that they kind of like grow from the left. They start out with a width of 0 and they start out in gray and then continuously change color. So I'm simply like initializing them here with the width of 0 and completely opaque with in gray. And then I am well, this is actually like, this is the enter selection here. Then here, what I'm specifying what is happening on the exit. So I'm starting out with like fully opaque elements. And then I am over the duration of 3 seconds by calling transition and duration. And then I'm setting the style at the end of the transition to opacity 0. And so that kind of like is this effect of that that removes those here, that fades them out. So it first fades them out and then it removes them. That's what's happening here. And then after this is like this transition is done, I am calling the remove element. And so now they're actually gone from the DOM. And then finally, here's how we handle updates. And this is just like exactly what we had before. And so D3 here is just like taking the elements that it had before and like applying the new style. Because I'm calling this transition duration, it is dynamically interpolating all of the attributes of all of the elements that that it has control over. So that includes X, Y, width, height, fill, opacity. All of those elements are simply like there's a linear interpolation between all of these numerical attributes, or even the color attributes, and you can like by just adding this line here, you can get these nice duration transitions. Okay, is there any questions about that?
I have a question about what is the hash next is doing in line number 64.
This is just like I want to switch between two data sets. And so I added a second button. I'm here. I have like this button with next that I can have switch between two data sets dynamically. Remember, we had this this one button here is generated by this run.js file, the run button. And then I'm adding, because I want to switch between those two, I'm adding this button. And when this button is clicked, this is actually, that's actually a good question, because this is how I do events in D3. Like we talked about the way about doing it in just plain DOM before, but in D3 I can actually do this like this. So I say D3 select the button next, and then on, and then I have all of these different event types on click, and then execute that function here on click. And that function here runs this function here, which does everything that you see in JavaScript here with the parameter of data. And if the data is specified, then it passes, like it uses that data. If that data is not specified, it uses that data.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I had a question on the exit transition.
Yeah.
So it's the first thing it does, it's setting the style opacity to 1. But the opacity is already at 1.
Yeah, this is more of like a pedagogic example here.
Okay, perfect.
So this should work just as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, great. So now what we also ask you to do in your homework is working with groups. And working with groups is actually fairly simple. It's very convenient. There's just one little thing that you need to handle if you have to update data, which you don't have to do in your homework too. So this doesn't really matter for your homework too, but for like later homeworks, it's going to matter. So what we want to do is we want to create a bar chart with a label. And so let me show you. So here is what I want to do. I want to create the bar and the label. And so what I'm doing behind the scenes is that I take that bar and that label here and put them in a group, because then I only have to pick the Y position here once. And then I can just like, don't have to worry about positioning like the label and the bar independently in Y. And this is kind of convenient because I have like a local coordinate system that I can work with when I want to position these labels, and I don't have to worry about any offsets. That makes your code easier. And so that's why these groups are useful here. And so like what I'm doing here is I am creating like a bar group. And so this is just a group. So I'm selecting on the empty bar group and bind that to my data. And now I have kind of like my group elements or my uninitialized enter selection that is bound to the data. Then with the enter selection, I'm appending a G, this group element, and I'm setting it to the class bar group because that is what I've just been selecting on here. And then I'm taking enter bar groups and append a rectangle to it, and then I'm styling that rectangle here. And then I'm adding a label to the group. So this is the second thing that I'm appending to the group, the text label here. And then I'm transforming, like I'm moving this label over by D so that it kind of is at the end of the bar. And the text itself in the label is exactly D because we just want to see what the data is. And then I'm positioning it locally, like DY here. I can just like position it within like the bar height. I don't have to worry about its Y position otherwise. So this is kind of like the basics of how I would do a group. But there's one little problem that I would have. If I now switch between two data sets, it actually doesn't update. So it adds and removes elements, but it doesn't update the already existing elements. Does anybody know why?
Do you need to remove the old data set?
I'm doing that implicitly. Yeah, I guess I need to. What is happening is behind the scenes is the data field in the rectangle isn't updated. So in that sense, yes. Any other ideas? I made like a beginner's mistake here, more or less. I am kind of like everything I'm doing here is only on the enter selections. I'm not actually handling the update selections correctly. And so here would be like an example on how to do the update selections correctly. And this is like similar kind of lesson as we had before. Here I'm taking care of my entering elements. I'm appending my G again. Then I'm appending my rectangle, but I'm initializing it only with like a standard gray. So like here you will see I get like this initialization here with the updates in these groups. And that's going to be the result of what we're doing here. So I'm just like adding some default configuration for my enter elements. Then I'm appending a text. I'm actually not putting anything into the text, but now I have all of the elements that I need in the enter selection. Here I'm taking care of the exit selection again. And then here I'm merging those. And so now this is the selection that actually, after this is run, that I want to really style well. And now I'm updating the groups. So I'm kind of setting the groups to their new position. So this is simply I multiplied by bar height. So this is like a simple way of positioning these bars. And what I'm moving here is the groups, right? I'm not moving the bars itself. I'm moving the groups that contain the bars and the text. Now I am calling on the group that contains the rectangles. I'm calling select rectangle. And this call select rectangle propagates the data from the group down to the rectangle. And now I can actually style this in the data-driven way. And now here I have the right data that was just bound to the group elements. And similarly for the text, I'm by saying bar groups.select the text, I have the right D, the right data bound to that element. And now I can actually do that correctly. So to recap, the difference between the two, the broken example and this example that works, is that here I only wrote stuff for the enter selection. So it worked for the first time, but I didn't really take care of the update selection. And the best way to do this in like a group example is to like first create everything as always, basically empty stubs of the elements, then merge it, then update your groups. And then in the group, select the elements, the sub-elements that you want to manipulate, because that makes sure that the data is passed on and that you have the right you have the right elements and you can style the right elements correctly. I'm doing some transitions here with, but we talked about this before. So yeah, this is fairly straightforward. One thing I'm doing is I do have different transitions for the labels than I have for the bars. So the labels, they appear at the bars kind of like change their positions. The labels appear at the end of the bar. So this is just like the way I chose to handle it. You could like actually have the labels appear immediately and move the labels over with it as well. Any questions about this? Okay, so next important concept in D3 that we need to talk about are scales. So up to this point, the data that we visualized, like if you look at this here, we had like 500, 100, and 120, which kind of conveniently map to pixel space. But that actually doesn't usually happen, right? So you have data that has some scale and you want to visualize it, but it doesn't mean that your data is in pixel space. And so here is a data set that doesn't work well in screen coordinates. So if I were to visualize this, we're using the method that we so far have used. I basically get these tiny slivers of bars here, and I barely can't see anything, right? And so what I need to do is I need to, like generally speaking, need a function that maps an input dataset D to a derived dataset D prime that is meaningful in screen coordinates. So in this case, it would just be like multiplying something with like 200 would be a simple solution. So I could simply say in here, D multiplied by 200. And that should work. But more generically, we kind of like want probably like we want a function that does that. We want to be smart about that function. And so this is how like we could do that. And so here I'm creating a scale function. And that function simply multiplies the input by 500, just like it did before. And then the scale function, I am simply calling that when I specify the width. And so that's fairly easy. It's more or less the same thing as it just did before. And that now works. So that's fine. That is optimized for that particular screen. So this isn't all that tricky. So we can write this on our own if you want to, but D3 has like a lot of really good implementation for many different kinds of scales, since it's all about data. And so we can use D3 scales because D3 also supports things like logarithmic scales, power scales, discrete scales for placing bars in bar charts, for example, color scales, ordinal data, temporal data, all kinds of scales with all kinds of variants that you could think of. And so it's kind of convenient if you know D3 scales, you should use them because they are just like a nice way of thinking about them, and it kind of like makes your code easier. So here's how I would define a D3 scale. So I'm saying my X scale, this is like everything that I'm scaling in X. So this is kind of like the width of the bars. I'm saying D3.scale linear. I want a linear scale. And then I have two other functions that I'm chaining here, the domain and the range. And those two are important. The domain here is what is the kind of like domain of my input data set, like what kinds of data values am I expecting? And I'm saying I want my domain to go from 0 to the maximum of what I have in my data set here. So I'm calling D3 max, which is just a function that returns the biggest value of an array. So that will be 1.5 here. I am using 0 because I want bar charts to start at 0. I could also use D3 min if I wanted to for the data, but that's not usually what I want in a bar chart because, well, we'll learn about this in a design lecture that we don't want to start. Like we need to be very conscious about our scales, and typically we want to start the scale at 0. Then the range is specifying the pixel coordinates, basically. So I have my input domain, and I want to map it to the output range, and do that in a linear mapping. So this is like what this says. And so here I'm saying the biggest value here should correspond to 700. The smallest value here should correspond to 0. And then what I'm doing is I'm just calling X scale of D in the width when I set the width attribute. And so that's it. And now that works just as well. So like I've done this now with a linear scale. I could also do that with a log scale. So let me show that. And now I would have a logarithmic scale, and I don't have to worry about like how do I actually do that mathematically. And that gets even more interesting, I guess, if I do color scales. And so we'll talk about that next. Well, before we do that, let's briefly talk about clamping. So sometimes you have like it's very common in data to have outliers that are very big, and so you need to kind of like. It sometimes doesn't make sense to use D3 max or the maximum value of a data set. So for example, here I have a value of 2 in this array. And if I were to plot this, if this were my screen, the gray rectangle here, then this bar would just be too big. If this would be kind of like, if I had something else here that would kind of clutter that space here and overlay that. And so one way to deal with that is to add this clamp function. So if I run this now, well, I forgot to remove the semicolon. If I run this now, this is clamped at the value here. So this is good and bad, because it is good because I'm not like kind of like drawing over an area where I'm not supposed to draw anymore. But of course, now I'm not actually showing the data faithfully anymore. So what I would have to do here is I would have to kind of like, if the data value is too high, I would clamp it, but then I would show additionally like a symbol, for example, that this is a broken bar, or I would color the bar, or have something special to indicate to a user that this is actually like a broken bar and it's not over, this isn't actually the data value. But you can use the clamp function to do that. Okay, more interestingly is color scales. And so here's an example that is a little bit more complicated. I now use a redundant encoding for color and width of these bars. I have a data set that has both positive and negative values. So I'm using a bimodal color scale. Like red means a low value, blue means a high value, and a long bar means like a high magnitude in like depending on where left or right of the axis here, either very low or very large. And I'm doing this like with an X scale in D3, and I'm doing this with a color scale. And so now let's look at how that works. Here's my data. So you see I have a mix of positive and negative values. My scale linear is, in this case, since I have positive and negative values, I'm setting my domain from the minimum of the data to the maximum of the data. And my whole rendering range is 0 to 800. Then I'm calling, here is where we define the color scale. And the color scale should also be linear. And here I'm setting my domain with an array of these 3 data elements. And notice here that I don't just say min and max, but I say min, 0, and max. And then I have my range, kind of like what I'm mapping to this in screen coordinates or in screen vocabulary is dark red for the minimum. That should map like the smallest value should map to the dark red. The middle value should, or 0 here should map to gray. And the biggest value here should map to blue. And then everything in between is interpolated. So everything between the minimum and 0 is somewhere between red and gray. Everything between 0 and the maximum is somewhere between light gray and blue. And that's like very convenient, right? Because doing something like that in color coordinates, that would be fairly tricky to actually write yourself. In contrast to just like the width function, which you can easily write yourself. And so then I'm just styling this. Here I have to take a little bit care because it's a little trickier, the exposition. The bar starts at like somewhere in the middle here if the value is positive, but it starts here if the value is negative. So I have to like, I'm taking the X scale and take the minimum of 0 and D. My width is the absolute difference of D and 0, and I'm applying in scale space. And then the interesting part here is the color scale. And so I'm just taking the color scale and putting in my value, and then this is how that particular bar is then styled. So that's very convenient, and I get this nice looking bar chart. Now, so far, like we have done labels once, but what we usually in visualization, it's always important to have like a legend or axis, just to make it obvious what the data is that you're actually talking about, what the range of data is. And so D3, if you use D3 scales, you can also very easily use axis with these scales. And so D3 has extensive support for axis. And so like I'll first show you again what we'll be doing here is we will be creating this axis here on top that is in data space. So the way to do this is fairly simple. I have my X scale again, as I had before. This is also what I had before my color scale. Here is how I create a new axis. So I say x-axis is d3.axis bottom, and that just means that this is an axis that is designed to be at the bottom of the charts. The line essentially is at the top, and then the ticks and the labels are below. And so there's an axis top, there's an axis left, and an axis right. And then these axes understand the scales of D3. And so now I can set x-axis, I can give it the scale. And now the axis knows what it's supposed to be representing. And then I am just like, this is just the same thing as I did before. The only thing that's new in this code here is that I'm actually calling that axis. So at the end of the SVG, I'm appending a G element. In that G element, I'm calling this axis function, which then generates the axis. Doesn't actually matter how this happens exactly. What matters is you end up with a G element that contains the axis here. So again, very convenient and very easy to use. I can basically, like, I don't have to do any tick drawing, any label placement. It even knows about the scales, and it's also easy to update the scales if you have to. So definitely worth using the axis elements of D3. Now, one thing that wasn't all that beautiful here is, like, notice those little 2 ticks here, and then it kind of gets cut off here on the right, and it's not positioned correctly. And so in the next example here, we'll look at taking care of all of these issues. I'm like drawing here like a big rectangle that is supposed to be my drawing canvas. And if I run that, like, I'm positioning now, I have really nice scales. They go from like round numbers, -1.4 to +1.4. I have positioned my axis correctly. I've also done padding around here. I've given this all kind of like with the rectangle and with the background a bit of a frame of reference. And so all of those things, and it's not really hard to do. And so let's look at what we're doing here. So first, I am setting a padding, 25 pixels on all sides. And then I'm setting my SVG. Like, I'm actually didn't specify how big my SVG is here. I usually did that. But here I am specifying the SVG dynamically. I'm setting its width is my drawing width plus 2 times the padding. My height is my drawing height plus 2 times the padding. Then here I'm just adding this gray rectangle in the background that has exactly width and height, and I'm moving it over by the padding. And then here's the stuff that is like doing actually the actual visualization. I'm setting up my X scale again. And what I'm doing here, which we haven't looked before, is this .nice function. And that's also another reason why these D3 scales are great, is because you have these .nice functions. And now D3 takes the best guess of taking your domain and fudging it a little bit so that it gets to nice round numbers. And if you have like a domain that is positive and negative, if they're almost the same, it will automatically make them the same, and so on. So nice is just like a couple of heuristics that try to make your scale look great. You can always do that manually by exactly optimizing your domain instead of putting in min and max, but very frequently just saying min and max and then doing nice gives you great results. Here's my color scale again. And then here I'm creating my my axis again. I could also manually set the ticks here, but I'm just setting this, I'm showing this later. For now, I'm just setting my scale again. And then here, what we do is we like moving everything over by padding a little bit. But otherwise, this stuff here is the same. And then what's new here is this axis styling. So I have, I'm calling classed axis. That is kind of like I did do some style definitions up here with the classed axis, and the axis have path, lines, and text. And I'm saying lines should be green, 1 pixel, text should be serif, and 14 pixels. So by saying this is of that class, I get all of this styling applied. And then I'm moving the axis to the right place, and then I'm calling it, and then I get the result here with this nice axis. OK, let me see what happens if I do the ticks here. You can see that we will get way more ticks. So this is not very nice, right? But we can to manually specify how many ticks we want in an axis. Any questions so far? Okay, so I only have one more example, but it is a big example. So I want to show a couple of things with this example. So far, we've only worked with simple arrays. But what happens if we have data like you have in your homework with like arrays of objects? How do we deal with that? Then I want to show how do we sort data and how do we update it based on sorting, because that's often very useful. How do we properly, like we did some padding up in the previous example, but it wasn't necessarily all that nice. And so how do we really deal with padding nicely? Then there's some more advanced stuff that we can do with scales if we have bars. So like whenever we place those bars, we have done the number of the bar multiplied by some constant factor, but that's actually fairly brittle. And so I could actually I could use D3 scales for bands to evenly space out the bars. Then how do we update a scale? And then the most important lesson of this example here is how to ensure object consistency for transitions using the key function of the data mapping, which is a handful, I know, but I'm going to show you what I mean. So the example here is I have like a grocery store has like purchases apples, bananas, plums, bread, cereals, beer, and wine. And these have like, I have weight in tons here. And then I have like a classification, like categorical data, like this would be numerical data. And then I have categorical data. Is it alcohol? Is it groceries? Or is it fruit? Okay, and I want to visualize this in this bar chart here. And so if I click run, I get like this nice bar chart that has the weight in tons. On the x-axis, it is colored by the type of product. Is it alcohol, groceries, or fruit? And then I can dynamically sort it by these different attributes. So here, if I'm sorting it alphabetically, then here I'm sorting it by weight. And then here I'm sorting it by type. And all of this animates nicely. And so I'm going to walk you through that example on how to do that. OK, so the first thing that we need to know is like, because we have these data, like these objects in the data, we have to kind of like be a little bit more specific with what we mean when we say D, right? So D would contain that object. And so whenever we want to map anything here, we can't just say D. We have to say D dot like field name. So in this case here, I'm saying, hey, what is my max value here? I'm calling like the max value here is supposed to be the maximum of the weight in the tons. I kind of like was lazy. I could have extracted the type from the data, but I just like this was just 3 types. So I simply defined my types here. I said grocery, food, alcohol. And that's OK. That's not necessarily super elegant. You should really like actually look at like what are the unique types, use a set or something to kind of disambiguate that. And then you can style it based on that. But for this very simple example, that is sufficient. So here I'm setting up the padding. I'm setting up margins in an object, top, right, bottom, left. And then I'm setting up my width and my height based on these margins in variables. So what I'm next doing here is I'm creating this big G element that contains everything and move it over by the margin. So I don't actually have to worry about anything anymore. I'm just like the positions, the padding here is kind of taken care of for me, because everything I'm going to do going forward is going to be in this chart group element. And by just appending it to the chart group element, my position, my coordinate system is local, and I don't have to worry about the padding anymore. Here's just some variables. So this here is kind of like, this is new. this is another scale. And these are band scales. And so I'll just quickly show, this is not supposed to be here. I'll quickly show what those are. So band scales are made for, like, I have my range here, and then I have things like discrete things like bars or rectangles in any way. And if I have like 3 of them, like here, 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, and 2, I can specify I want these elements to have a certain like width. They have to have a certain padding. They have a certain step width, and so on. And so by doing that, I can kind of like create like a scale for my discrete elements like bars that I want to place dynamically. And so what I'm doing here is I'm simply saying, I'm actually not setting the domain yet. I'm simply saying d3.scaleBand. This is like this discrete scale. It goes from range 0 to height with a padding of 0.1. I'm actually not setting the domain yet. I'm going to set the domain later because this is like this stuff here. And what I'm looking through right now is called only once, and everything in here is called every time I change something, so I update something. So then I'm initializing my x-axis, which stays constant, which is fairly easy. And then I'm setting up my axis, and I'm like putting it to the right place. And then here, this is like everything that comes below here is called every time I change something in the, like when I change something here, the whole execute is called again. And then everything here is updated. And I'll show you later how this is done. So first, I am like this here. What I'm doing is I'm initializing my band scale. And I'm actually saying, hey, this is the data. I'm taking like from the data, I'm using a map function to just get the products out. So because I want my my Y scale here to be based on the products, these are like these discrete, the products here are the labels here. So I want a bar for each of these data entries. So I'm kind of like saying, essentially make an array out of all of the possible products here. And then I'm setting that to be the domain of that Y scale. So that means I have a bar for every single object in my data set. Then here I am kind of creating the bar groups. And then this here is the key piece. I have to kind of like identify, like I have to, we haven't really like, objects we haven't moved around objects. That we have moved around, we have changed objects, but we haven't moved around one object from one place to the other, which is exactly what we're doing here. And so if we did just what we did before, let me just show that quickly. What the problem is. So if I now click run, something I broke. So if I now click run, that works. But then when I try to update, now stuff is changing, but it's not moving around sensibly, right? So if I say type, like I start out with beer, but you see the animation kind of like didn't make sense. What I want is this bar chart to move smoothly down and not to suddenly change color and then start changing the size of the bar. I instead would rather like, these animations make no sense at all, right? This is not like I'm just moving stuff around here. I don't want everything to start to rescale and recolor. What is happening is that D3 doesn't know about the identity of these objects, so it doesn't know that it's supposed to be moving it around. Instead, it's just like taking the first element and applying like the new first element and then changing all of these style attributes. But if we tell D3, like this here is actually the Apple's bar, and this here is actually the Banana's bar, and all I want to update is their position, then it can actually do that. It can interpolate position for us. And we need to tell D3 explicitly, like, what do we consider to be part of an object that it needs to move around? And we can do that with this key function here. And so let's see. So we just go back to what we had before, and then remove that again. So this is what we had before, and now this is going to work again. And so this is where we do our data binding. So this data is clear. Then here we do a data binding. But what's new here is the second function. Is we have this data here is more complex than a single value, right? Because we have this object. And we now, by like passing along this function, we tell D3 what is kind of like making this object unique. And we do that by providing this key function, and we are saying d.product is what makes this item unique. So like if you want to move something around, like you should compare d.product. If you have your array, the data array is being sorted behind the scenes, you want to kind of like look at the product name to identify where to move it. Does that make sense? Any questions about this? Play around with that, because that kind of takes a while. Whenever you have a funky animation that just doesn't make sense, in practice, it's almost always that you don't have a key function or you have a wrong key function. So just very common problem. And this is the way to solve it, by just setting like what makes your object unique. Okay. Let me see. What did I want to talk about here? Yeah, so here is where we position the bars with this new band scale. And so we are actually positioning the whole group and not an individual rectangle. So we're doing this grouped here again. And we're calling yscale d.product. That's kind of like, again, our yscale also knows about the product names. And then by calling that, it gives me, OK, in the data that we've just bound up here, that particular product that you're looking at right now is at position 2. In the scale, that means it is at pixel 222 or something like that. And that's what's happening here. I'm just using this kind of like a little bit fancier syntax of constructing that string for the translation here. Okay, so the other time I'm using this y scale is here. I am setting like the y scale, as we saw here in this example, it has like its starting position, but it also has like, it also gives us information of how big a bar should be in that example here. And so we can say yscale.bandwidth, but all of these bars are the same width, so we don't actually have to pass in a d or anything like that. And then I am just like doing some placement for like this is a text element. So I'm just placing it at the end. I'm centering it and so on. So this is all like standard SVG stuff. And then here, again, I am setting the height of the rectangle, the width of our bars, to be the bandwidth from the y scale. Here we apply the color scale. And then here we apply we want to kind of like, when we resort them, we want to dynamically like move them around. And so that's why we are like actually applying a transition here. And then finally, here we're setting the width, which we always specify based on the weight in tons in here. OK. So what we now have to do is like, this is doing the sorting. So we like, well, this is actually doing the re-rendering of the sorting, like positioning it to the new place. And this here is doing the sorting. And so this is like, I'm going to walk through this first. This is just like essentially saying again, after an animation, after I have to have resorted my bar chart, just do this transformation and move it to the new position. And that's it. And so also fairly simple. OK, so final thing here is the sorting itself. Again, the sorting is actually fairly easy. I just need to like have an event listener. I'm saying d3 select.sort select. This is this drop down box here, the sort select item. If that was changed, then call this function. And this function here changes the data. So this function here sorts the data based on based on the value that we select in this drop down box. So if we say product, then it puts in this here is called with the active here. Like I'm retrieving that as we saw earlier in this lecture. I'm retrieving what is the active value of the drop down box. And then here I just have a switch statement in that sort function. And I say if it's a product or a type, then sort it lexicographically by that value. If it is a weight, then sort it numerically. And that's all I'm doing in here. And after this is done, I return a data set that is now sorted differently. It has the same elements, but it's sorted differently. And then I'm calling execute again. And execute has this global variable data. And so then everything starts over from, where are we? From here. So everything after this is then again being executed as soon as I have kind of like gone through that selection. Okay, that was my last example for today. This is also pretty exactly time. I'm happy to take a couple of questions, but otherwise I think I'm aware that this is a lot, but these are also meant to be kind of reference examples that you should go back to when you're doing a homework or when you kind of look this over, when you look at your project, and you'll find like these helpful, and you can think about these individual concepts that we covered today when you actually need them.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
On that, on the event handler that you just showed us, how does the D3 event target? How does it distinguish this particular event from some other when the function handler doesn't have an event parameter passed? Like if there was another event that fired, what would keep D3 event target value from returning the value associated with that other event?
That's a good question. I would say that there's probably some namespace magic going on here. But I would also say that it's probably better to pass in a parameter in here.
Okay, so that function will take an event then? I guess that would make sense because that's what changed. Okay, cool.
I have a question.
Sure.
So the material that you covered for today's lecture, it seems like part of it is for help with this current assignment and also in preparation for the next.
You don't actually need anything of like how I covered today for the current assignment, right?
Okay.
I didn't like this was all about updating, and there is no updates at all in the current homework.
Okay.
Only the stuff at the very beginning that I covered, that was kind of like a recap of what I covered last week. And so some of those, of course, applies, but there wasn't like basically nothing that I talked about the first time today should you need on the homework too.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing and I'm gonna stop the recording.